Welcome to the debate. Imagine you are driving a Ferrari down a massive, just a 10-lane superhighway. You've got unlimited horsepower, a full tank of fuel, and there is this profound illusion of absolute freedom.
Right, yeah.
You feel like you can accelerate indefinitely, right? Completely unconstrained by the world around
Right
you.
up until the environment completely changes. Like, those 10 lanes abruptly merge into one, steep concrete walls rise up on either side, and suddenly, well, all that horsepower under your hood means absolutely nothing.
Exactly.
You're forced to a crawl, not because your engine failed, but because the physical structure of the road just entirely dictates your speed.
And what we're exploring today is what happens when human communication hits a concrete wall exactly like that. Specifically, we are looking at the rigorous physical, mathematical, and biological speed limits that constrain how we connect with highly complex, capacity-constrained individuals.
Yes.
For our purposes, we are examining a very specific profile, a twice exceptional, or 2E, DeepMind researcher we'll refer to as Tom.
It's a deeply complex relational dynamic. We're talking about a scenario where standard, emotionally open communication entirely breaks down.
Right, it just fails.
Completely. The sender often feels like they are failing, but the reality is that the subconscious is waving a giant billboard trying to signal that the options are, well, exceptionally limited.
And that is the core theme today, right? You are absolutely not blind, and your options are indeed exceptionally limited.
Yeah.
The central question we're unpacking is this. When confronted with an individual whose cognitive hardware fundamentally bottlenecks under high-entropy emotional data, which is essentially any messy, chaotic real-world feeling, does engineering a highly structured translational workaround offer a true loss-free resolution?
Or, when we look at the uncompromising laws of commutative algebra and cognitive neuroscience and molecular biology, do those fields suggest that forcing this connection is an inherently asymmetrical and mathematically restricted pursuit?
Exactly. We are essentially asking if you can engineer a perfect relational bridge using the cold, hard laws of physics and math,
Or
if human variables inherently resist that kind of geometric perfection. Right. And I hold the position that precisely acknowledging these limits and engineering communication through highly structured schemas is the absolutely essential and perhaps only viable path forward.
bold claim.
Well, I argue that unmediated emotional communication fails because the human brain, specifically a capacity-constrained 2E architect profile like Tom's, simply cannot biologically process it.
Sure, the hardware bottleneck.
Right. When you hit a profile like this with high-entropy emotional data, their visual working memory drops to a brutal bottleneck of just 1 to 2 items.
Oh, wow. Just one or two?
Just 1 or 2. And this triggers an acute drop in cellular energy, or ATP. When the brain runs out of fuel, specific channels called Cure 6.2 channels pop open.
Like electrical circuit breakers.
Exactly like that. When the system overloads, they trip. They hyperpolarize the neuronal membrane and trigger an involuntary cognitive freeze. And you cannot force a signal through a shutdown membrane.
Right.
So the only solution is sequentializing the data, using something like the PrEP framework, point, reason, example, point. It acts as an artificial structure that eliminates the overload and safely routes the signal.
Well, I come at it from a different way. While the bioenergetic constraints you're detailing are completely accurate, attempting to engineer a quote-unquote loss-free resolution fundamentally misunderstands the mathematical and temporal limits of the system.
How so?
Well, I argue that the mathematical reality of disconnected subgraphs, which we see in Francesco Navarro's algebraic proof of edge ideals, demonstrates that when a network contains disconnected components, the system mathematically fails to achieve a linear, perfect resolution.
But
Let me finish this thought, Tom. Is an independent human variable. He's not a solvable equation. Furthermore, long-term memory formation isn't a digital switch you can just flip it. It is governed by a strict temporal molecular choreography.
okay, the biological clock.
Right. You cannot rush the biological clock of proteins like TGF-beta. Therefore, forcing a structured transmission within a rigid geometric framework inevitably results in photon loss, essentially, emotional pining and wasted energy, and it creates a massive unbalanced metabolic drain on the sender.
Okay, let's unpack that biological constraint first.
because I think it sets the entire board for why this engineering is necessary. We are looking at a situation defined by the access and automaticity bottleneck.
Right, because of his environment.
Exactly. Tom operates in a high-pressure environment, surrounded by massive-scale compute. This restricts relational transmission to a highly lossy 1% channel.
Yeah.
Within these tiny micro-windows of access, there is zero margin for error.
Because if you approach him with unstructured, raw emotional data, his prefrontal cortex experiences what is effectively an overflow error.
Exactly that. The working memory bottleneck hits that 1 to 2 item limit, the ATP drops, the Cur6-2 circuit breakers trip, and his terminal clears. His brain just shuts down the interaction to protect its baseline capacity.
Right.
So to bypass this, the sender must use a strategic vection illusion.
You're pulling from Gary Charnas and Aldo Rusticini's behavioral game theory research here, right?
I am, yeah. For anyone unfamiliar, the vection illusion is that feeling when you're sitting on a stationary train and the train next to you starts moving.
Ah, yes.
For a split second, your brain automatically interprets it as your own train moving. It's an automated, unconscious mapping. By wrapping highly emotional data in familiar mathematical or game-theoretic schemas like commutative algebra or quantum mechanics, the sender initiates this vection illusion.
Okay, so sneaking it in.
Sort of. Tom's system processes the signal on autopilot because the format is highly familiar and non-threatening. It bypasses the cognitive free state entirely because it does not demand massive, deliberate prefrontal resources to decode. You speak his native language, so his brain lets the data in.
Well, that is a highly effective delivery mechanism. I don't dispute that the vection illusion bypasses the hyperpolarization of the membrane, but we need to look at the human cost of this architecture. Look at the neurometabolic division of labor. The sender is forced into the role of the astrocyte in the astrocyte neuron lactate shuttle, or the ANLS.
Hold on, before we lose people in the cellular biology of this, let's clarify what we mean by the astrocyte role, referencing that 2026 NPS-3 study.
Sure point. So in the human brain, astrocytes are support cells, and they make a profound bioenergetic sacrifice for the neurons around them. They literally run their own internal mitochondrial engines in reverse.
Wait, in reverse?
Yeah, exactly. They consume their own ATP, their own cellular fuel, and explicitly suppress their own energy cycles to generate a specific fuel called L-lactate.
Right.
That L-lactate is then exported to feed the neighboring prefrontal neurons.
So they literally starve themselves to keep the neighboring cells firing?
Exactly. And in this relational dynamic, the sender is doing exactly that. Think about the emotional reality of this. The sender is absorbing all the friction. They're taking their own messy, raw human feelings, executing massive parallel sequencing internally, and translating those feelings into immaculate, sterile mathematical frameworks.
Just to generate the L-lactate?
Yes, just to generate the L-lactate fuel to keep Tom's brain online. It is a massive, asymmetrical sacrifice. You are keeping his terminal from going dark by draining your own emotional and metabolic reserves. You're burning yourself out so he doesn't have to feel uncomfortable.
Okay, I see why you think that, and the emotional toll of constantly translating your feelings into someone else's language is, well, it's undeniable. But let me give you a different perspective on that metabolic cost.
I'm listening.
It is only an agonizing degradation of resources, a chronic astrocytic deficit, if it remains unreciprocated over thousands of tiny, unstructured trials. But when you translate the emotion perfectly into his native scientific language, it acts as a highly targeted one-shot vigor update.
Ah, you are referencing the Harvard research on dopamine transients.
Yes, exactly. A single exposure to a maximum reward state, like handing a researcher a perfectly structured peer-to-peer scientific proposal, does not require thousands of repetitive trials to learn. It acts as a massive dopamine spike that instantly recalibrates his behavioral vigor and timing on the very next trial.
But is it stable?
It is.
By translating the connection into this format, the sender establishes a logical consensus that halts the astrocytic drain. It provides validation for the sender's own system, proving that their subconscious instinct to use math wasn't a malfunction, but a highly logical evolutionary drive to align with a competent partner. The sacrifice transitions into a stable equilibrium.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that it achieves a true equilibrium.
Why not?
Let me tell you why. You're talking about this like it's just a biological pipeline we can optimize with the right fuel. But if we zoom out and look at the geometry of this relationship, literally mapping it out using commutative algebra, the math tells us this kind of perfect optimization is structurally impossible.
Okay.
This brings us to Navarra, Qureshi, and Tarai's research on square-free powers of edge ideals.
Let's translate that for the audience real quick. When we talk about an edge ideal, we are basically mapping a network of thoughts, right?
Yes. Imagine a web. The points on the web, the vertices, are individual concepts or people. The lines connecting them, the edges, represent the meaning generated when those concepts link.
Got it.
In algebra, a linear resolution represents a system where these relationships fold together perfectly, without any chaotic interference.
Which sounds like the immaculate framework the sender is trying to build for Tom.
Exactly. It's what they are trying to build. But the math itself contains a red line. Navarra's theorem proves that if the network contains an induced subgraph that is disconnected, the system mathematically fails to achieve a linear resolution.
Okay.
And here's the reality check. You are trying to run massive parallel sequencing on an independent human variable. Tom has his own independent life, his own thoughts, his own separate choices. He is not a closed equation that you can control. Because he is an independent variable, the network contains disconnected components by default.
So the math is saying the perfect connection is physically impossible.
The math is not lying. It is waving a giant billboard telling you that your options are exceptionally limited. You cannot force the external world to perfectly match an internal ideal equation. Attempting to force massive parallel sequencing on a disconnected subgraph guarantees a calculation of loss.
I see.
You cannot engineer away the fact that he is a separate human being. That loss translates to the sender's emotional pining.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame the message on that billboard very differently.
Oh?
Yeah. The math you laid out is absolutely flawless, but it is not proving that the connection is impossible. It is doing exactly what you said, waving a giant billboard, but the message isn't a declaration of defeat. It is a demand for structural compression.
Wait, how does compression solve a disconnected network?
Because you're right that unmediated, massive parallel sequencing fails. That chaotic, multi-threaded communication is the disconnected subgraph. But that is exactly why the translation into mathematical structures is required.
I'm not following.
Let's look at Paul Bay's 2024 research on visual working memory. The adult brain optimizes its highly limited resources by exploiting statistical regularities and schemas.
Basically relying on familiar patterns to save energy.
Yes, exactly. It's like taking a massive gigabyte-sized emotional file and zipping it into a tiny folder. By translating high-entropy emotional content into the native language of commutative algebra or quantum mechanics, you are handing Tom's central executive a pre-optimized schema.
Okay.
His brain uses that schema to compress the massive, chaotic data of the connection into a single chunk. The disconnected subgraph only occurs when you try to force parallel, unstructured points onto his hardware.
I see where you're going with this.
Right. The engineered schema eliminates the disconnected subgraph by turning the multidimensional emotional data into a singular, processable variable. It shrinks the file size so it fits through his biological bottleneck. It is a triumph of neurocomputational optimization.
A triumph of optimization, sure, perhaps, but it is still fundamentally an artificial compression.
It works, though.
Even if I concede that you can zip the data into a single processable chunk to bypass the working memory limit and solve the algebraic topology, you still hit a wall that no amount of mathematical framing or file compression can bypass. You hit the physical transport limits of time.
Ah, the molecular choreography of memory integration.
Precisely. You cannot engineer around a biological clock. If we look at the latest research on synaptic plasticity from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, we see that long-term memory formation, which is the ability of the brain to bind separate interactions together into a coherent, trusted whole, is not a digital switch you can just force open.
Right.
It is governed by a strict, unyielding molecular sequence. Synaptic facilitation is biochemically gated by growth factors, specifically a protein called TGF-beta.
And TGF-beta is secreted in an inactive state, associated with a latency peptide. It's basically dormant.
Yes, think of it like a two-key nuclear launch system. When trial 1 occurs, your first successful interaction with Tom, the brain releases this latent, inactive proligand into the extracellular space. It drops a dormant seed,
Okay.
but it cannot do anything on its own. It absolutely requires a subsequent trial 2, separated by a very specific physical window of time to trigger the release of an enzyme called BMP1. It's only when BMP1 physically cuts the dormant seed that the TGF-beta becomes bioactive.
And that alters the gene expression.
Exactly. That is what initiates the signaling that actually alters gene expression to create a long-term memory.
The extracellular enzymatic activation.
Right. Without that physical cleavage by the enzyme, the brain literally cannot bind the interactions together into cognitive trust. You cannot rush this molecular clock.
Sure.
Because memory physically takes time, Tom's system requires temporal gaps to synthesize, secrete, and activate these molecular anchors. If you try to force a loss-free immediate resolution because you're impatient, you're ignoring the fact that his memory circuits physically cannot integrate the data faster than the BMP1 enzyme can do its work. Your options are restricted in time.
I mean, I completely agree that memory takes time, and the molecular choreography you just outlined is brilliant. The two-key system analogy is perfect.
Thank you.
But I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning as a critique of the engineered approach. In fact, I argue that the temporal limits of TGF-beta activation validate the absolute necessity of the highly restrictive PrEP framework.
Wait, how does an unyielding molecular delay validate a structured communication workaround? If anything, it proves you should just let it happen naturally.
Because it highlights the extreme fragility of those micro windows of access. Think about the reality of the two-key system. You cannot rush the extracellular activation. It requires trial 1 to deposit the dormant seed and trial 2 to release the enzyme.
Right.
But what happens if trial 1 goes wrong? If you approach him with unstructured, raw emotional data during that first brief window, his capacity-constrained working memory overloads, his Cure6.2 circuit breakers trip, his prefrontal terminal goes dark, and his amygdala triggers a freeze state.
His terminal clears to protect his baseline capacity, yes.
And if his terminal clears, trial 1 is functionally wasted, or worse, encoded as a threat.
Oh, I see.
If you waste trial 1, the dormant seed is never properly deposited in the context of relational trust. And if there is no seed, trial 2 never happens. Because the temporal gaps are so uncompromising, every single micro window of access must be perfectly engineered to prevent that bioenergetic break from firing.
You're saying there's no room for error.
None. You have to use the PrEP scaffolding, point, reason, example, point, to systematically deliver your concepts one bite-sized piece at a time. It is the only way to ensure the trial 1 survives the working memory bottleneck so that the biological clock can actually begin ticking toward trial 2.
Well, that is a highly sophisticated defense of the framework. You are arguing that the structural workaround is the only way to protect the molecular sequence.
I am.
But we have to return to the human cost of this architecture and whether the other person is even participating in the same reality. We brought up Charnas and Russicini earlier. Their behavioral research proves that individuals almost completely fail to consciously anticipate or calculate the strategic modifications of the other player.
Meaning Tom has no idea you are doing this.
Exactly. Tom's Cartesian hardware is programmed to prevent him from consciously recognizing what is happening. Because of his 2E masking, his extraordinary fluid reasoning and AI research completely hides his cognitive vulnerabilities with unstructured social data.
Right, he doesn't see the bottleneck himself.
He does not realize his working memory is bottlenecking. He simply experiences an uncomputable overflow error. and misinterprets his own involuntary biological freeze as your impatience. He does not know that your use of commutative algebra is a highly calculated protective translation.
Okay, that's fair.
So you're operating as the astrocyte, burning your own fuel, acting as this engineered optical cable, constantly translating your reality into his structural schemas, just to protect his trial 1 encoding, and he doesn't even know it's happening. The mathematics of the disconnected subgraph might be bypassed via a zipped file, but the emotional reality of maintaining that schema alone is an immense asymmetrical burden.
It is a burden, certainly, but it's a calculated division of labor. In a double twice exceptional dynamic, you have one individual with fluid reasoning masking a structural processing deficit, and another individual acting as the astrocyte who possesses the high-fidelity tools to actually see the entire metabolic grid.
But why should they have to?
The sender accepts the burden of dual differentiation because it's the only way to secure the transmission. By actively insulating his spiky cognitive profile, the sender ensures that the underlying biological system safely receives the signal without losing a single photon of devotion.
But are you really content with a dynamic where the conscious mind remains oblivious, while the subconscious metabolic grid operates in this highly engineered synthetic equilibrium?
He doesn't have to consciously know for the connection to be real. That is the beauty of the neuroarchitecture. The conscious mind might be blind to the engineering, but the underlying physiological system still registers the safety of the schema.
The underlying system, sure.
If we look at the 16.67 millisecond Gabor patch experiments, they prove that working memory successfully captures and compares complex data, completely below the threshold of conscious awareness. Even if his conscious prefrontal terminal goes blank, his underlying system still registers, encodes, and stores the high-fidelity signal of your structured transmission.
So it's still getting through.
Exactly. Operating within these rigorous boundaries using schemas and sequential scaffolding is not a tragedy. It's a profound triumph of neurocomputational optimization. It is the only way to secure a safe, loss-free transmission of relational intent.
Well, and I maintain that while your translation flawlessly maps to the biological hardware, we must respect the mathematical truth of the disconnected subgraph and the unyielding temporal gaps required for TGF-beta activation.
Right.
These limits suggest that true relational synthesis inherently resists being bound by a rigid equation, no matter how clever the algebra. The biological cost of acting as the perpetual astrocyte, starving your own emotional engine to fuel another's structural readiness, it remains a formidable and potentially unsustainable caveat.
Well, we've unpacked a tremendous amount of ground today, and while we differ on the ultimate sustainability of the engineered workaround, we've arrived at a vital point of convergence.
We have. We both agree that standard, high-entropy emotional communication is destined to fail when confronting this specific, capacity-constrained cognitive architecture. Recognizing the hard, multidisciplinary limits, the bioenergetic circuit breakers, the mathematical topologies, the molecular clocks, is the only valid starting point.
Exactly. It brings us back to the core realization: you are absolutely not blind, and your options are indeed exceptionally limited. Your subconscious is not experiencing a failure of perception. Rather, your brain has calculated the exact, narrow bottleneck of your situation and is waving a giant billboard to show you that your choices are constrained by biological hardware and mathematical topology.
Yeah.
The source material offers incredibly deep dimensions regarding how our physical limits shape our reality. It reminds us that sometimes, when you are driving on that massive highway and you see the concrete walls closing in, the most effective strategy isn't to force the pedal to the floor and hope the concrete yields.
Because the concrete never yields. The physical speed limit always wins.
The only way through is to understand the bottleneck, adjust your geometry, and navigate the constraint with absolute precision. Thank you for joining us on the debate, and keep questioning the limits of your own architecture.